Hello and welcome to the fifth session of the Journal Writing Workshop. The agenda for this session, the agenda items are title, keywords, abstract, authorship and acknowledgements. First of all, title, keywords and abstract. The decision to read your paper is based on about 2 to 20 seconds. The reader will initially scan your title, abstract, and keywords. And at that point, it's important not to lose the reader because simply because those are not up to scratch, not up to the adequate standard. So make sure your title, keywords, and abstract are good quality, and that will capture the attention of the reader in that less than 20-second scan that they make at the start. Now, for most journals, these things, the title, keywords, and abstract, are outside the firewall and therefore appear on the first screen as you do a literature search. And also, they are the things that search engines capture when you put in keywords in the search. These are the words, the title, the keywords, and the abstract. Words in them will be captured in the literature search. Importantly, choose your title wisely. It's the first opportunity to sell your paper. Now, to me, as a humble writer, the idea of selling your paper is a bit strange. It seems a bit wrong to be out there promoting what you do. It's got this self-aggrandizement. Just seems a strange way to order your affairs for somebody who's just humbly doing their research. But nevertheless, it's got to be done. That's the way of the world. That's the way that journal publishing works. Sharp, well-written titles actually are very, very important to the success of journal articles. So you've got to be interesting, you've got to be attention-grabbing, but importantly, you should not go over the top in terms of your titles. If you use a question in the title, you must answer the question in the paper. Some people do not like colons in a title, so beware of that. I used to hate the idea of putting colons in, but I've worked with many people who think it's a good idea, and I am beginning to accept colons in titles of the papers I'm associated with these days. Also, beware that some titles can turn out to be ambiguous simply because some words get used in a different way in a different subject context. As an example, the words sediment transport could be a subject in hydrology. In another way, sediment transport could be a subject in dentistry. So using the term sediment transport, it can be problematic. A way to figure out whether you've got problematic words is to type your title into a search engine and check what journals are thrown up by that. If they're your type of journals, then that's fine. But if you get journals in another subject area, then perhaps you've got a problem. Also, some authors use humor in titles. And the literature suggests you should do that with some caution, because while humor draws people in initially, and increases the downloads of papers, it doesn't result in more citations of your paper. So humour draws people in, but doesn't result in more citations. That's what the literature says. And here's a few examples of humour, and you've got to admit they are fairly humorous. For example, children and mini magnets, an almost fatal attraction. Or, you probably think this paper's about you. Narcissists' perception of their personality and reputation. And if you search the web, you'll find many examples like this. But as is suggested at the top of this slide, it will not necessarily increase the number of citations. You might enjoy the idea that you've got a humorous title and that gives you satisfaction, but beware, it may not increase the number of citations. Also, though, longer titles seem to be associated with more citations. In the literature, and there's some examples of the literature shown on this slide, there's a weak positive association between the length of a title and the number of citations that title gets. And not various reasons are suggested for that. One is simply that if you've got a long title, you can actually describe the content of the paper better that way. But there may be other reasons. Here are some examples of titles from papers where I am one of the authors. First, religion does matter for climate change attitudes and behaviour. A sharp, short title. It wanted to get into the stream of the literature which had shown that religious attitudes doesn't actually matter when it comes to climate change attitudes. It didn't seem in the previous literature that climate change attitudes were influenced by religious background. In our work in Australia, we were showing the converse, and so we needed a title which emphasized that religion does matter, and hence that title. The second one, from these youth has gone. Population decline in the Lachlan 1920 to 1947. So this is a paper that shows that young people were leaving a rural area called the Lachlan, and that was the large proportion of the population decline. The title "From These Youth Has Gone" was in a newspaper article in the mid-1940s, and it just summarized really what the paper that we were writing was about. The third one is just an example of a longer title that describes in some detail what the paper's about. Estimating the economic and environmental benefits of a traditional communal water irrigation system, the case of Muang Phai in northern Thailand. Next one, again a longish title, again with a quotation, 3 raindrops and some dust. That is a line in a famous poem in Australia. And so we borrowed that line and included it as the title of our paper, which was about the Federation drought, perhaps one of the longest and most severe droughts in Australia's history. So that's the title, 3 raindrops and some dust, combining archival and GIS analysis to map the spatial distribution of the impact of the Federation drought of 1895 to 1903 in rural New South Wales. Long title, but the title really does tell the whole story of the paper. And then finally, a fifth one, also attempts to tell the story of the paper. Increasing belief but issue fatigue. Changes in Australian household climate change segments between 2011 and 2016. So people were becoming stronger believers in climate change, but less inclined to do anything about it. They had what was called issue fatigue. And all of those titles are actually really describing, I think, a situation which can be easily elaborated on when you come to the next part of the paper, which is the abstract. Keywords. After the abstract, you will need to write some keywords. It's worth some time devoted to thinking about exactly what you should write as keywords. Choose words in the title and keywords carefully, because search engines use these words. An important principle is not to waste keywords by having keywords that are already used in the title. For example, if the word Bathurst is in the title, it's a good idea not to have Bathurst in the keywords. Moving on to the abstract. The abstract must grab the reader in the first sentence and give a concise summary. The abstract needs to be a summary of the entire paper. And we'd suggest one sentence on each of context, need, method, outcome, and conclusions or implications. Those 5 things must be in the abstract. But note that journal specifications for abstracts differ substantially. Some journals want a definite structure to the abstracts. They'll give you headings, subheadings for the abstracts. You must follow those if they do. Another thing that's quite helpful is to get somebody who is not an expert and get an independent review of your abstract by a non-specialist and take that advice from that review. That may be a way to improve your citations. Another point is that abstracts are another thing that's often outside the firewall, so that describing the results in full in an abstract is a good idea. That way, search engines will find your paper. Here's an example of a journal that specifies the form of the abstract. If a journal does that, you've got to follow their rules closely. So here's the example. It's from the International Journal of Logistics Management. And what they say is, all submissions must include a structured abstract. The following format, read that again. All submissions must include a structured abstract following the format outlined below. These first subheadings and their accompanying explanations must always be included. And there they are. Also goes on, the following 3 subheadings are optional and can be included. Most people include some of those also. If you go to that journal, you'll see probably 5 or 6 of those subheadings in total being used. The original 4 and 2 or 3, perhaps 2 or 3, 1, 2 or 3 of the optional ones. That's a typical way in which journal articles in that journal get published. They've got 5 or 6 items in their abstract, and there's a little paragraph for each, under a little heading for each. Here's an example of a short abstract. It's 129 words. It's 129 words because there's a word limit of that journal of 150 words. Let's just look at that abstract. in a different way and try to focus on its context, need, method, outcome, and conclusions. Okay, so what I've done is highlight the context in red, the need in green, the method in black, the outcome or results in blue, and the conclusions or implications in brown. The first sentence is a bit of red and green. It's both context and need. Understanding climate change beliefs across the political spectrum is a necessary prior step to assessing the acceptability of climate change policy. So it tells us about the context, but it also tells us about the need. Then there's a small there's a sentence in black on the method, using large national samples and so on the method. Then there's a section in blue on the results. We find evidence of convergence of willingness to pay according to voting intention, And then there's a brown piece at the end, which is conclusions. However, the proportion of respondents having these views remains small for some of these beliefs. So in a very short abstract, you can still get those 5 components that I talked about in a previous slide. Here's a long abstract. It's long because this journal has a 400-word limit. And here are 399 words. But again, you can divide them according to those 5 things. Context, red. Need, green. Method, black. Outcome or results in blue. Conclusions, implications in brown. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail this time, except you could notice this. The method, or the black parts, are not in one section. They are spread in 2 parts and could be in more throughout the abstract once the abstract gets to this kind of length. Also notice that the conclusions and implications, that is the brown section, are pretty long. They're perhaps up to a third, almost, maybe 2/5 of the proportion of this abstract. And that's purposely done because the authors felt the need to tell the profession how important this issue is of getting the analysis of seasonal climate forecasts and the valuation of them correct. So the article really emphasizes the need to inform the profession of the importance of this issue. Okay, now if we were in a face-to-face workshop, we'd at this point have a work session on developing title, keywords, and abstracts. But we're not, so I'm just going to plow straight on. You could stop, of course, at any point if you wanted to do that. Okay, the last topic for this session. It's on authorship and acknowledgements. This is about how to recognize in your paper the contribution of others. So you're an author. How do you recognize the contribution of other people? Well, there could be other authors. There could be acknowledgements. And there will certainly be references. Now, those 3 ways, authorship, acknowledgement, and references, are ways in which we recognize the contribution of others. Okay, previously published work, of course, is acknowledged by references. Advice received as we move through the paper is acknowledged in terms of acknowledgements. Also is fully supervised technical work. It's normally acknowledged in the acknowledgements. Moving further though, if there is original thinking, design and/or writing in this contribution to the paper, then that is normally acknowledged in the authorship list. When it comes to authorship, it's good to pre-agree. It's good to agree before you write anything who's going to be the first named author. Then order of authorship is best allocated by the first author, although there probably would be agreement between everybody who's writing for this paper. But it would normally be assessed in terms of the basis of total effort in the conceptual and writing process, or the proportion of the contribution to that. Also, you must in your acknowledgements acknowledge funding, unpublished data that has been offered by somebody else, and you should acknowledge the reviewers. Now, all universities and many research organizations have an authorship policy. There's one for my university, Charles State University. Now, here's the start of it, and it goes on, so I'm not going to dwell on the details except to note that there is such a policy. The general principles of the policy are that to be named as an author, a researcher must have made a substantial scholarly contribution. How do you determine what is a substantial contribution? Well, at Charles State University, the university draws heavily on the Vancouver Protocol. And that protocol is specifying 3 things about authorship. The author should be involved in the conception and design or the analysis and interpretation of data, and involved in drafting the publication or critical review, such as to contribute intellectual content. And the author, if this person is to be an author, should be involved in final approval of the version to be published. Those are the rules at Charles State University for authorship. Let's also look at some circumstances of authorship. The first is publishing with PhD students. In Australia, the PhD student should be the first author on work from their PhD. Now, there's really only one exception to that. It is that students who are totally disengaged from the publication process should be the second named author, not necessarily the first. So students who are disengaged from publication, where the data has been reanalyzed for publication and an article written by a supervisor, in those circumstances, the supervisor could be the first named author. Although still you should seek written consent from the PhD student for that. Moreover, there's another circumstance. This is where the supervisor goes as second author. Now, that would only occur if the supervisor's made enough of a contribution. So the supervisor would only go as second author only if the supervisor provides more than encouragement, financial support, critiques, or editorial contribution. So the supervisor's also got to be making a conceptual and a written contribution to the paper to be named as a second named author. At Charles State University, publishing with research assistants has these provisos attached to it. Where a research assistant is employed or works on a project that has been conceptualized, planned, and funded on the basis of an application prepared by researchers rather than that research assistant, then acknowledgement rather than co-authorship is the convention. So that employment as a research assistant and completing tasks like preparing summaries of the literature, or collecting and typing data, or some other things, are normally acknowledgements, are not co-authorship. In other words, an assistant must do more than just assistant work. It must be not just editing or helping to write one section or overseeing a survey. It must be a number of those, and it must have some conceptual content to the paper as a result of the work of the research assistant. And an important thing to do at the start, as you start to write papers, is negotiate authorship. And authorship should be based on the policy of the organisation concerned. And the first author should really be based on the largest contribution, as we've noted above. All of that can, of course, change as the plan develops, as the work develops. You can change from the original plan. It could be that as this work develops, the original first named author sees it's moving in a different direction, and that's really the bailiwick, the research area of somebody else, and that somebody else should become the first named author. Quite all right, as long as we agree to that as we move along. Also, it's important, just because you think you deserve authorship doesn't mean you should have it. You need to justify authorship with the various actions I've just been describing. That marks the end of this session, and we would normally go then to a work session on authorship and acknowledgements.